The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet of the Texas hill country as the sun bled red across the horizon. Eivelyn Ashford ran through the brittle brush, her breath ragged and her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. Her skirt snagged on thorns, her boots slipped on loose stones, and blood trickled from her scraped ankles. Still, she did not stop. She could not stop. Behind her, the wagon smoldered in a dying glow, and the man who called himself her husband lay lifeless beside it. He had not died protecting her. He had died trying to sell her. The memory drove her forward with a strength she did not know she possessed. Smoke stung her lungs, and the fading light turned the sky into a wash of crimson and gold. She stumbled down a rocky slope, her vision blurring with exhaustion, until a single ranch house appeared between two ridges. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its chimney, steady and calm against the restless sky. Eivelyn had no plan beyond reaching it. The wooden porch creaked beneath her trembling steps. She gripped the post and sank against it, her body too weak to stand. A barn door slammed in the distance, and a man stepped into view, wiping his hands on a worn rag. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his tan shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing strong forearms streaked with dust and sweat. He froze when he saw her, his sharp gaze narrowing with caution. "I ain't here to steal," Eivelyn rasped, her voice raw from smoke and fear. Please!" The man placed the rag on a fence post and walked toward her slowly, like approaching a frightened colt. "You hurt?" he asked quietly, but she shook her head, though pain throbbed along her ribs. "I can pay for water and a ride in the morning, You're not sleeping out there," he said firmly. "I'm not asking for—" He shifted his stance, his jaw tightening. "You can sleep on the porch or in my bed," he said. "I'll take the floor, or saddle up and ride out. Your call." Eivelyn stared at him, dust clinging to her skin and exhaustion weighing heavy on her soul. There was no smirk, no hint of mockery in his voice. He stood as steady as the oak beams holding up the porch, waiting for her answer. "In your bed," she whispered. He nodded once. "Name's Orion Zeller." "Eivelyn Ashford." He opened the door. "Come on in, Miss Ashford." The cabin was small but warm, with a stone hearth glowing softly and a narrow bed tucked along the far wall, and the cotton sheets were rough but clean. Orion stoked the fire, spread a blanket on the floor, and handed her a tin cup of water. Then he leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, giving her space. They did not speak again that night. The clock above the mantel ticked slow and steady. When Eivelyn fell asleep, it was not from exhaustion alone, but from the strange comfort of silence and safety. The next morning, the smell of eggs and bacon filled the cabin. Orion stood at the stove, his back to her, his hair still damp from washing at the pump outside. "I put your dress by the hearth," he said without turning. "Mended the hem." She blinked at the neat stitches. "You sew?" "I run a ranch alone. I do a lot of things." He glanced over his shoulder. "Eat, then tell me what happened." Eivelyn sat quietly at the table, and her hands wrapped around a warm cup. After a moment, she spoke. "I was married off in the Oklahoma Territory. His name was Ralston. Seemed kind at first." Her voice trembled. "Last week he lost everything in a card game. Tried to trade me to settle his debt. I ran." Orion listened without interruption, his eyes steady and patient. When she finished, he nodded once. "Someone might still be looking for you. I cut across the scrubland, lost track of them. Then you stay here until you know you're clear. I've got work if you want it." Eivelyn stared at him in surprise. "Why are you doing this?" His gaze met hers, calm and certain. "Because someone should have helped you sooner." Days turned into weeks. Eivelyn found herself hauling buckets, feeding hens, and mending fences beneath the wide Texas sky. Orion gave her a spare pair of trousers and a shirt. They fit awkwardly, but they freed her arms to work. They spoke little, yet he always brought her coffee first, waited for her to sit before eating, and never walked behind her. One quiet evening, they stood side by side on the porch, watching the stars bloom across the dark sky. "Why are you alone?" she asked softly. "My wife died in childbirth," Orion replied. 7 years ago. I'm sorry." He nodded once. "You?" "My parents died in a barn fire. I was 15. My aunt raised me until she married me off." They stood in silence, the night air cool and still. "I don't trust easy," she said. "Neither do I," he answered. A month passed, and life settled into a steady rhythm. One afternoon, Orion returned from town with a tense look on his face. "Marshall says a man's been asking about a woman from Oklahoma," he said. "Name was Ralston." Eivelyn's stomach tightened. "He's alive." "Sounds like it." "I can't go back," she whispered. "You won't," Orion said firmly. "If he steps near this place, he won't walk away." His words held a quiet promise that steadied her trembling heart. 2 weeks later, the past came riding up the ridge in a cloud of dust. Ralston's cruel face twisted into a sneer as he reined in his horse. "You think you can hide from me, girl?" Eivelyn backed away slowly, but Orion stepped forward, a rifle already in his hands. "She's not hiding," he said calmly. Ralston reached for his pistol, but Orion was faster. The shot echoed through the hills. Ralston fell from his horse, clutching his wounded leg. By nightfall, the marshal had taken him away. That evening, Eivelyn sat by the fire, her knees drawn close. Orion placed a cup beside her and sat quietly on the hearth. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I think I am." "You still want to leave?" She looked at him, her eyes soft. "No." Orion reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. His voice was low, steady. "I don't want you on my porch anymore. I want you in my bed. With me." Her breath caught. "Then ask." He met her gaze. "Stay here with me, as my wife." Eivelyn rose and stepped closer, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. She climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck, her heart finally at peace. "I picked the one with your arms," she whispered, and he held her like the world had finally come home. The first frost came early that year, settling like a silver breath across the Texas hill country. Dawn broke cold and quiet, the fields glittering beneath a pale sky. Eivelyn Ashford Zeller rose before sunrise, pulling Orion's old wool coat around her shoulders as she stepped out to scatter feed for the hens. Her breath curled in soft clouds, and the sharp chill stung her cheeks, but she welcomed it. The cold made her feel alive, rooted in a place that finally felt like home. Inside the cabin, Orion worked beside the hearth, carving a small figure from a block of cedar. He never called it carving, only something to keep his hands busy through the winter months, but Eivelyn saw the care in every stroke of his knife. When he finished, he placed the wooden horse gently on the mantel, beside the tin box that held their marriage license. She did not ask if it was meant for her, and she already knew. Days passed in quiet harmony. They worked side by side, speaking little but understanding everything. Eivelyn learned how to wrap cloth around the pump handle to keep the cold metal from burning her palms. Orion showed her how to read the sky for storms and how to mend leather with steady hands. In return, she filled the cabin with warmth, humming softly as she cooked or stitched worn seams by the fire. He never mentioned the melody, but he lingered closer when she sang, as if the sound anchored him. One afternoon, while clearing fallen branches along the southern trail, Eivelyn paused near a cluster of cottonwoods. A weathered grave marker stood alone beneath their branches, its wood worn smooth by years of wind and rain. "There's no name on it," she said quietly. Orion rested his hands on the axe handle. "My brother," he replied after a moment. "Didn't make it back from the war." She looked at him, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. "You were both in it?" "I enlisted." He followed. His gaze remained fixed on the grave. "I made it home. He didn't." Eivelyn did not ask more. She simply stood beside him until the silence felt less heavy, their shoulders nearly touching beneath the rustling leaves. Winter deepened, and life settled into a steady rhythm. Eivelyn cleared an old shed near the chicken coop, turning it into a curing room for meat and herbs. Orion patched the roof and hung new hooks along the rafters, while she tied muslin sacks filled with dried apples and corn. They worked without haste, building something lasting with each passing day. When Saturday came, and they rode into town together for the first time since their marriage. Orion saddled the bay mare for her himself, tightening the cinch with careful hands. Eivelyn mounted confidently, her back straight as they rode side by side along the ridge trail. As they entered town, her fingers tightened on the reins, but Orion's steady presence beside her calmed the tremor in her chest. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You're the one staying at the Zeller ranch," he said. "I am," Eivelyn replied, her voice firm. "Good to see it. That man's lived too many quiet years." She glanced at Orion, who was examining a tin of nails as if it held secrets. They purchased coffee, lamp oil, and a bolt of muslin, trading rabbit pelts for a few precious coins. On the ride home, yet the wind carried the scent of cedar and frost, and Eivelyn felt a quiet pride settle in her chest. She was no longer running. She was building. Months passed, and spring crept gently across the hills. Apple and plum saplings took root behind the shed, their fragile branches tied with strips of cloth to mark their place against the wind. Orion carved their initials into a new gatepost, small and careful, just enough to catch the sunlight. By summer, the land answered their labor with green fields and steady harvests. Evenings found them on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills in hues of gold and lavender. One night, Orion placed a small carving in her hands, two figures seated beneath a tree, rough but unmistakable. "I made it to keep something safe," he said softly. Eivelyn traced the figures with her fingers, her heart swelling. "Nothing safer than your hands," she whispered. The seasons turned again, carrying them through harvest and into another winter. In the quiet warmth of the cabin, Orion built a cradle by the fire, carving small stars along its wooden frame. Eivelyn watched him, her hands resting gently over the life growing within her. When their daughter was born on a clear spring morning, her cry filled the cabin with new hope. They named her Clara, after the word for clear skies. Orion held the child with trembling hands, his eyes bright with wonder, while Eivelyn rested against the pillows, her heart fuller than she had ever known. They planted a cherry tree that year beside the others, its slender branches swaying in the breeze. It stood as a promise of all they had built together, of love rooted deep in the soil, of strength found in quiet moments, and of a future no longer shadowed by fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the hills glowed in soft amber light, Eivelyn stood beside Orion at the edge of their field. Clara slept in her arms, wrapped in a quilt stitched from her mother's cloth. The wind moved gently through the young trees, carrying the scent of earth and blossoms. "We've come far," she said softly. Orion slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "And we're just getting started." She leaned into him, watching the sky fade into twilight. For the first time in her life, she felt no need to run, no fear of what tomorrow might bring. She had chosen her path, and it had led her here, to a home built with steady hands and a love strong enough to weather any storm. And she knew with quiet certainty that she would always choose the place where his arms waited for her. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know." The years that followed unfolded with a quiet strength, like the steady rise of dawn over the Texas hill country. Time softened the edges of hardship, replacing them with the gentle rhythms of family and land. Orion Zeller rose each morning before the sun, stepping out into the cool air to tend the fields and livestock, while Eivelyn prepared breakfast inside the warm glow of the cabin hearth. Clara's laughter soon joined the sounds of their days, light and bright, like the wind chimes Orion had carved and hung by the porch. The little ranch grew with them. The apple and plum trees they had planted stretched higher each season, their branches heavy with fruit by late summer. The cherry tree, planted for Clara, bloomed each spring in a shower of pale pink blossoms that drifted like snow across the yard. Eivelyn would lift Clara into her arms, pointing to the petals dancing in the breeze, telling her stories of patience, of roots, and of the strength it took to build something lasting. Orion watched them often from the barn doorway, his weathered face softened by a quiet smile. He had once believed the land would be his only companion, a place to bury memories and keep to himself. But Eivelyn had changed that. She had filled the silence with purpose, turning his solitude into a home where love grew as surely as the crops beneath the sun. As Clara grew older, she followed Orion through the fields, as her small boots stumbling in the dust as she tried to match his long strides. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to listen to the wind, and how to care for the animals with patience and respect. In the evenings, she would sit at Evelyn's feet, learning to stitch and mend, her tiny fingers clumsy but determined. Their laughter carried across the porch, mingling with the golden glow of sunset. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned shades of amber and rust, Orion stood beside the fence, watching Clara chase fireflies in the fading light. Eivelyn joined him, slipping her hand into his. The years had traced fine lines around their eyes, but their bond had only deepened, rooted in trust and quiet devotion. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" she asked softly. Orion's gaze drifted to the porch where Clara's laughter echoed. Every day," he replied. "The night you showed up here, running from a life that never deserved you." Eivelyn smiled, the memory still vivid in her heart. "You gave me a choice when I had none left." He turned to her, his voice steady and warm. "You chose to stay." "And I'd choose it again," she whispered. The seasons turned once more, carrying them through harvests and winters, storms and sunshine. The ranch flourished under their care, and the cabin that once stood alone became a place filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet strength of family. Each year, on the anniversary of the night they met, Orion would bring Eivelyn a new carving, small wooden figures of horses, trees, and stars, tokens of the life they had built together. One spring morning, as the cherry tree bloomed brighter than ever before, Clara ran toward them with a handful of petals clutched in her small hands. "Look what I found!" she cried, her eyes shining with wonder. Eivelyn knelt beside her, brushing a strand of golden hair from the child's face. "These blossoms mean something special," she said gently. They remind us that even after the hardest winters, beauty finds its way back. Orion rested his hand on Eivelyn's shoulder, his touch steady and sure. Together, they watched their daughter dance beneath the falling petals, her laughter echoing across the fields like music carried on the wind. In that moment, the past felt distant, its shadows softened by time and love. The fear that once chased Eivelyn across the hills had long since faded, replaced by the certainty of a life built with care and courage. She had arrived at the ranch broken and afraid, but she had found strength in Orion's quiet kindness, in the land they nurtured together, and in the family they created. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a warm golden glow over the fields, Orion drew Eivelyn close. She leaned against him, her heart full, her eyes shining with quiet peace. "I picked the one with your arms," she murmured, her voice soft with emotion. He held her gently, the world around them calm and endless. "And I'll always be here," he said, his words as steady as the land beneath their feet. The wind rustled through the blooming trees, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. And there, beneath the wide Texas sky, Eivelyn knew she had found more than a home. She had found a love strong enough to endure every storm, a future bright with hope, and the quiet certainty that she would always belong in the place where his arms waited for her. Their story, once born from fear and flight, had become one of courage, trust, and enduring love. A tale written not only in words, but in the steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one beneath the endless horizon of the Wild West.